The great hall of the Galactic Concord stretched for nearly a kilometer, its crystal walls catching the light of 3 artificial suns that floated above the gathered delegates like burning jewels in the darkness of space. Ambassador Velkith of the Rithani Dominion stood at the central podium, her silver scales gleaming as she raised all 4 of her arms in a gesture of welcome to the thousands of representatives who had come from across the known galaxy to celebrate this most important of days. 10,000 years, she announced, her voice carrying through the chamber with perfect clarity. 10,000 years of peace, of progress, of unity among the stars. The crowd erupted in applause, and the sound was like thunder rolling across an ocean. Wave after wave of celebration from species that had once been enemies, but now stood together as one great civilization. Velkith smiled, showing her needle-like teeth in what her species considered a sign of warmth and friendship, and she continued her speech with growing confidence. We gather today to remember a time when the galaxy was not so peaceful, when chaos and violence threatened to tear apart everything our ancestors had built over millions of years of careful evolution and growth. She paused for effect, knowing that every eye in the chamber was fixed upon her, knowing that billions more watched from their home worlds through the crystal net broadcasts that connected all members of the Concord. "We remember the humans," she said, and a ripple of nervous laughter spread through the audience. Those strange creatures from a small blue world who burned so brightly and so briefly before vanishing from existence. More laughter now, more confident, as the delegates recalled the old stories their parents and teachers had told them about the mythical species that had supposedly threatened the galaxy so long ago. They were aggressive, yes, Velkith continued with a dismissive wave of her upper right hand. They were violent and unpredictable, and they fought wars over the smallest of disagreements. But let us be honest with ourselves on this day of celebration. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow still reached every corner of the massive hall. They were more myth than menace, more legend than threat, and we have spent 10,000 years proving that the galaxy is better, stronger, and more united without them. The applause that followed was the loudest of the evening, and Velkith basked in it like a cold-blooded creature warming itself under a generous sun. Far from the celebration, in a region of space that the star charts marked with warnings and symbols of danger, a young surveyor named Torek guided his small vessel through the darkness between dead stars. He was Velmari, a species known for their curiosity and their unfortunate habit of going places they should not go. And he had spent the last 3 cycles mapping the outer edges of what the Concord called the Forbidden Reach. Nothing out here but dust and old graves, he muttered to himself as he checked his sensors for the 100th time that day, just like all the cycles before and all the cycles to come. But then something changed. A light appeared on his sensor screen, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. And Torek leaned forward in his chair, with his large eyes widening in surprise and confusion. "What in the name of the first stars is that?" he whispered as his instruments began to scream warnings at him, as the energy readings climbed higher and higher until they exceeded anything in his database. Deep in the heart of the Forbidden Reach, hidden among the ruins of civilizations that had died before the Concord was even born, an ancient structure that the old records called the Precursor Gate began to wake from its 10,000-year slumber. The gate was massive, a ring of dark metal nearly 50 kilometers in diameter, covered in symbols and patterns that no living species could read or understand. And it had sat dormant and silent since before recorded history began. But now it hummed with power, and the space around it began to twist and bend in ways that violated every known law of physics. Torek watched his sensors with growing horror as the energy readings continued to climb, as his ship began to shake and rattle from forces he could not see or comprehend. "Concord Command," he shouted into his communication array, his voice cracking with fear. This is survey vessel Bright Hope transmitting from coordinate 773 in the Forbidden's Reach. Static crackled back at him, but he kept talking, kept screaming his warning into the void. There is something happening here, something impossible. The old gate, the precursor gate from the Forbidden's archives, it is activating. The energy levels are beyond anything I have ever seen. You must send ships, you must send the fleet, you must... He never finished his sentence. The gate exploded open with a burst of light that turned the darkness of space into blazing day, and the shock wave that followed tore through Tarek's tiny vessel like a hurricane through a paper lantern. In the great hall of the Galactic Concord, the celebration continued, the delegates laughing and drinking and congratulating themselves on 10,000 years of peace and prosperity. They did not know that somewhere in the Forbidden's Reach, a door that should have stayed closed forever had just been blown off its hinges. They did not know that the myths they had laughed about were about to become terrifyingly real. And they did not know that the galaxy was about to remember, in blood and fire and screaming terror, exactly why their ancestors had feared the humans. Ambassador Velkith raised her glass in a toast to another 10,000 years of peace, and the crowd cheered, and the crystal walls rang with the sound of their joy. But in the depths of space, something was coming, something old and battle-scarred and filled with memories that stretched back across 9 millennia of endless war. The humans had not died. The humans had not vanished. The humans had been fighting, surviving, evolving, becoming something that even the nightmares of the elder species could not have imagined. And now, at long last, they were coming home. The gate hung open in the darkness, a wound in the fabric of reality itself. And through that wound came the first whisper of a message that would soon echo across every world in the Concord. It was a simple message, transmitted in a language that had not been spoken in 10,000 years. A language that every species recognized from their oldest and most forbidden archives. The message said only this: "We remember." And in the great hall of the Galactic Concord, as the delegates celebrated and laughed and dreamed of endless peace, no one heard the distant thunder of humanity's return. Not yet, but they would. Oh, they would. Admiral Sierra of the Vethkai stood on the command bridge of her flagship, the Eternal Vigilance, and watched through the viewing screens as 400 warships of the Grand Fleet jumped into formation around her. She was tall for her species, with skin the color of deep ocean water and eyes that glowed with bioluminescent light. And she had commanded the Concord's military forces for nearly 200 years without ever facing a real enemy. "Status report," she demanded, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos of the emergency mobilization. "All vessels in position, Admiral," her second-in-command reported. "We are receiving data from long-range sensors, but the readings make no sense." "Show me," Sierra ordered, and the main screen flickered to life with images that made her blood run cold. The precursor gate hung in space like a wound that refused to heal, its ancient metal frame glowing with energies that should not exist. And around it swirled debris that had once been survey vessel Bright Hope. But that was not what caught the Admiral's attention. Through the gate, emerging from whatever hell lay on the other side, came a ship unlike anything in the Concord's records. It was black, so black that it seemed to drink in the light around it. And it was massive, nearly 7 kilometers from bow to stern, covered in scars and battle damage that told the story of conflicts beyond imagination. "What is that thing?" one of her officers whispered, and Sierra wished she had an answer to give. The ship moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, gliding through the debris field without effort, its hull reflecting nothing, revealing nothing. And then the transmission began. Every screen on every ship in the Grand Fleet flickered and changed, and every speaker crackled with static before a voice emerged, a voice speaking a language that had not been heard in 10,000 years. "This is the United Nations Starship Remembrance," the voice announced. last survivor of the Terran Expeditionary Force, requesting contact with whatever governing body now controls this region of space. Sierra felt her hearts, all three of them, skip a beat as the words registered in her mind. Terran. Human. It could not be possible, and yet the evidence floated before her eyes, black and scarred and terrifyingly real. Open a channel, she commanded, and when her communications officer hesitated, she repeated the order with steel in her voice. Open a channel now. The screen shifted again, and Sierra found herself face to face with something that was almost human, but not quite. Something that had clearly been modified and changed and rebuilt over centuries of desperate survival. The creature, the man, she corrected herself, had skin that was pale as bone, with lines of silver metal running beneath the surface like circuits in a machine, and his eyes burned with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. I am Admiral Sierra of the Galactic Concord, she announced, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. You have entered sovereign space without authorization, and I demand an explanation for your presence. The human, if he could still be called that, smiled, and there was no warmth in the expression, only the tired patience of someone who had seen too much and fought too long. I am General Elias Crane, he replied, and I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but we did not have time for proper protocols. Time? Sierra repeated. What do you mean you did not have time? Crane's smile faded, and something dark and terrible moved behind his eyes. The Hollow are coming, he said, and the words seemed to drain all warmth from the bridge of the eternal vigilance. They are a force from beyond your dimension, a swarm that feeds on consciousness and matter and everything in between. And they have been trying to break through to this galaxy for 9,000 years. Sierra felt her crew shifting nervously around her, felt their fear spreading like a disease through the ship. We've never heard of these Hollow, she said, trying to maintain her authority, and we have certainly never seen evidence of any threat from beyond our dimension. Of course you have not, Crane replied, and his voice carried the weight of millennia, because we have been holding the line, fighting them in the sealed space where your ancestors trapped us, dying and killing and dying again to keep them from reaching you. The Admiral did not know what to say to that, did not know how to process the implications of what this ancient warrior was telling her. You have 6 cycles, Crane continued. 6 cycles before the Hollow breach the secondary gates and pour into your galaxy like a flood through a broken dam. 6 cycles? Sierra repeated. That is not enough time to prepare for anything. Then you had better start immediately, Crane said, and his image flickered as data began streaming alongside it. Schematics and tactical analyses and weapons designs that made Sierra's military engineers gasp in shock and disbelief. What is this? She demanded. Everything we have learned about fighting the Hollow, Crane answered. Every weapon, every tactic, every strategy that has kept humanity alive for 9,000 years of endless war. He leaned forward, and his burning eyes seemed to look directly into Sierra's soul. We will teach you how to fight, he said, or you will learn how to die, and the choice must be made quickly, because the Hollow do not wait, and they do not negotiate, and they do not show mercy. The transmission ended, and the bridge of the eternal vigilance fell silent. Admiral Sierra stood motionless, staring at the black shape of the Remembrance as it hung in space like a promise and a threat and a warning all at once. 400 warships of the Grand Fleet surrounded her, the greatest military force the Concord had ever assembled, and she knew with terrible certainty that it would not be enough. Send a message to the Council, she ordered at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Tell them that the humans have returned. She paused, watching as the Remembrance began to move again, gliding through space with the confidence of a predator that had forgotten how to fear. And tell them, she added, that they have brought war with them. The Grand Fleet held its position, 400 ships facing one, and every officer and crew member aboard those vessels felt the same cold truth settling into their bones. The age of peace was over. The humans had come home, and something far worse was following close behind. The council chamber erupted in chaos the moment Admiral Syrah's message arrived. Delegates screamed at each other across the crystal floor, their voices blending into a storm of fear and anger and disbelief that echoed off the walls like thunder in a canyon. Ambassador Velkith stood at the center of the madness, her silver scales now dull with stress, her forearms waving as she tried to restore order to the assembly. "We must destroy that ship," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "We must destroy it before these so-called humans can spread their lies and their violence across our peaceful galaxy." "And if the general speaks the truth?" countered a delegate from the Morvex collective, his insectoid features twitching with nervous energy. "If these hollow creatures are real, we will meet every ally we can find." The humans were monsters. Velkith fired back. "Our histories tell us they were violent and unpredictable and dangerous beyond measure. Our histories tell us they were weak." Another voice called out, "Our histories tell us they failed and vanished and posed no real threat." The argument continued, growing louder and more heated with each passing moment, and no one noticed the small figure of Archivist Kelran slipping through the crowd toward the central podium. Kelran was old, ancient even by the standards of his long-lived Rathani species, and he had spent the last 500 years studying the forbidden sections of the Great Archive, the sections that most scholars pretended did not exist. "If I may speak," he said, his voice soft but somehow carrying across the entire chamber, silencing the delegates with its unexpected authority. Velkith turned to face him, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Archivist Kelran," she said, "this is hardly the time for historical lectures." "On the contrary, Ambassador," Kelran replied, "this is exactly the time, because everything you think you know about humanity is a lie." The chamber fell completely silent. "What are you talking about?" Velkith demanded, but there was fear in her voice now, fear that she could not quite hide. Kelran raised his ancient hands and activated the holographic display system, filling the air above the delegates with images and documents that had not been seen in 10,000 years. "The official history tells us that humanity was a failed species," he began, "aggressive but primitive, dangerous but manageable, ultimately destroyed by their own violent nature." He waved his hand and the images shifted, showing battle footage that made several delegates cry out in horror. The truth is far more terrifying. The footage showed human warships tearing through fleets that dwarfed them in size and number, showed weapons that cracked moons and shattered planets, showed soldiers who fought with a ferocity that defied all logic and reason. Humanity's first interstellar war lasted less than a decade, Kelran continued. In that time, they developed technologies that took our species millions of years to discover, and they used those technologies with a ruthlessness that horrified the precursor races. "The precursors?" someone whispered. "They were just legends." "They were real," Kelran replied, "and they were afraid. More afraid than they had ever been of anything in their billion-year history." He showed them more images, biological weapons that could rewrite the genetic code of entire species, artificial intelligences that waged war with cold efficiency across 1,000 battlefields at once, soldiers who had been modified and enhanced until they barely resembled the creatures they had once been. "The precursors could not defeat humanity," Kelran said. "They tried, and they failed. And in their desperation, they chose a different path." The holographic display showed the precursor gate, showed ancient beings working frantically to activate it while human fleets closed in around them. "They sacrificed themselves to power the gate," Kelran explained. "They used it to fold space around Earth and all the human colonies, sealing them away in a separate dimension." "They quarantined them," Velkith whispered, understanding dawning on her face. "Yes," Kelleran confirmed, "but not just to protect us from humanity." He paused, and his ancient eyes were filled with sorrow. They sealed the humans away with the Hollow, hoping that the two greatest threats the galaxy had ever known would destroy each other. The chamber was silent, every delegate frozen in shock and horror. "But the humans did not die," Kelleran continued. "They survived, and they fought, and they learned." He gestured toward the display, which now showed General Crane's scarred face. 9,000 years, the archivist said. 9,000 years of endless war against an enemy that should have consumed them in days. And they are still fighting, still surviving, still standing. "That is impossible," OpHFY protested, but her voice was weak, uncertain. "Nothing is impossible for humanity," Kelleran replied. "That is what made them so terrifying, and that is what the precursors could never understand." He turned to face the assembly, his ancient body straightening with unexpected strength. "We did not save ourselves from humanity," he declared. "We simply delayed the inevitable, and in doing so, we created something far worse than anything we could have imagined." "What do you mean?" the more vexed delegate asked. "I mean that we took a species that was already the most dangerous thing in the galaxy," Kelleran answered, "and we gave them 9,000 years of practice against an enemy that would have destroyed any other civilization in months." He let that sink in, watching as the delegates processed the horrifying implications. "The humans who left were warriors," he said. "But the humans who return are something else entirely. Something that has been forged in a fire that we cannot comprehend. Something that has learned to fight and kill and survive against forces beyond our darkest nightmares." OpHFY sank into her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What do we do?" she asked, and for the first time in her long career, she sounded genuinely lost. Kelleran looked at her with something that might have been pity. "We pray that General Crane meant what he said about teaching us to fight," he answered. "Because if the Hollow are truly coming, humanity may be the only thing standing between us and extinction." "And if we refuse their help?" another delegate asked. Kelleran smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "Then we will learn exactly why the precursors were willing to sacrifice everything to lock the humans away," he said, "and we will learn it far too late to matter." The chamber remained silent, and outside the crystal walls, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to the fate of the civilizations that orbited them. But somewhere in the darkness between those stars, the Hollow were moving, gathering, preparing. And aboard the Remembrance, General Elias Crane waited with the patience of a man who had already seen the end of one galaxy. He would not let it happen again, not while humanity still remembered how to fight. The sky above the Concorde's capital world had always been beautiful, filled with the soft glow of 3 moons and the distant sparkle of 1,000,000 stars. But on the 6th day after General Crane's warning, that sky turned black. Not the black of night, not the black of empty space, but a living, writhing black that seemed to swallow light itself, a darkness that moved and pulsed and hungered. Admiral Sarah watched from the bridge of the Eternal Vigilance, as her sensors screamed warnings that she could barely comprehend. "How many?" she demanded, her voice tight with controlled fear. "We cannot count them, Admiral," her sensor officer replied, his hands shaking as he worked his console. "They are coming through rifts all across the system, millions of them, billions maybe." The Hollow had arrived. They poured through tears in reality like water through broken glass. Creatures that existed between dimensions, entities that fed on consciousness and matter with equal hunger. Some were small, no larger than a human fist, but they moved in swarms that blotted out the stars. Others were massive, kilometers long, their bodies a nightmare combination of chitin and shadow and screaming faces that seemed to be trapped just beneath their surfaces. "All ships, open fire," Sarah commanded, and the Grand Fleet unleashed everything it had. Plasma beams cut through space. Missile salvos erupted from 100 launch bays. Energy weapons of every type and power level stabbed at the approaching swarm. And nothing happened. The hollow absorbed the attacks like water absorbing drops of rain, the energy simply vanishing into their impossible bodies without effect. "Admiral," her weapons officer cried out, "our weapons are not working." "Nothing is working." Sierra watched in horror as the first wave of hollow reached her forward ships. The cruiser Bright Star was the first to die, its shields failing in seconds, its hull dissolving as the smaller hollow creatures swarmed over it, consuming metal and crew with equal appetite. Screams filled the communication channels, the sounds of soldiers dying in ways that Sierra's mind refused to process. "Fall back," she ordered, but she knew it was hopeless, knew that her fleet was being slaughtered, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. And then the Remembrance moved. The ancient human warship had been hanging back, watching, waiting, and now it surged forward with a speed that should have been impossible for something so large. "General Crane to all Concord vessels," a calm voice announced over every channel. "Stay behind us and do not interfere." "What can one ship do against this?" Sierra demanded. "Watch," Crane replied, and there was something in his voice that made her blood run cold. "And learn." The Remembrance's hull began to shift and change, panels sliding open to reveal weapon systems that defied every law of physics the Concord understood. "Activating Doctrine 7, Crane announced. "All stations weapons free." The first weapon fired. Sierra did not know what to call it, did not have words for the beam of absolute darkness that lanced out from the Remembrance's bow. But where it touched the hollow, they simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not killed, but erased, removed from reality as if they had never been. "Reality anchors deployed," another human voice reported. And suddenly the hollow stopped flowing through space like shadows and became solid, became real, became vulnerable. "Null cannons charging," yet another voice called out. "Firing in 3, 2, 1. More beams of impossible darkness, more hollow erased from existence. And now the swarm was screaming, actually screaming in a frequency that made Sierra's teeth ache and her vision blur. But that was not all. Hatches opened along the Remembrance's sides, and drop pods erupted into space. Hundreds of them, each one carrying something that Sierra's sensors could barely register as human. The soldiers who emerged were nightmares given flesh. They wore armor that seemed to be grown rather than built, black and silver, and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. They carried weapons that fired beams of light that burned the hollow from the inside out. And they moved with a speed and ferocity that made the hollow look slow and clumsy by comparison. Sierra watched, her mouth hanging open, as a single human soldier tore through a hollow broodmother with his bare hands, ripping the creature apart while laughing on the open channel. "For Terra!" The soldiers screamed as they fought, for the Remembrance, for the long war. Another human grabbed a smaller hollow and used it as a weapon, swinging the creature like a club to smash its companions into oblivion. Yet another activated some kind of personal weapon that created a sphere of antimatter, detonating it inside a hollow hive cluster and taking 1,000 of the creatures with her. She reformed moments later from a device on her belt, her body rebuilding itself in seconds, and she charged back into the fight without hesitation. "They die and come back," Sierra whispered, unable to believe what she was seeing. "They die and come back and keep fighting. We have had 9,000 years to perfect the art of war," General Crane said, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "Death is no longer an obstacle for us, merely an inconvenience." The battle raged for hours, and slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The hollow were not retreating exactly, but they were dying faster than they could pour through the rifts. And their screams of hunger had become screams of something else. Fear, The Hollow were afraid. Admiral Sierra had never imagined she would see such a thing, had never believed that creatures from beyond reality could feel terror. But she saw it now, saw it in the way they pulled back from the human soldiers, saw it in the way they fled from the Remembrance's weapons, saw it in the way they seemed to hesitate before attacking, as if they knew that death awaited them and they were no longer sure they wanted to face it. "This is what humanity has become," Sierra murmured, and she understood at last why the precursors had been so afraid. It was not just the weapons. It was not just the soldiers. It was the absolute, unwavering refusal to stop, to surrender, to accept defeat. The humans did not fight like warriors. They fought like something that had forgotten how to do anything else, like something that had become war itself. And as the last of the Hollow fled back through their rifts, as the battle finally came to an end, Sierra knew that the galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had returned, and they had brought with them a fury that would echo through the stars for 1,000 generations to come. The Battle of the Concord lasted 11 days. When the last Hollow fled screaming into the dark spaces between dimensions, the survivors looked upon a galaxy forever changed. 60% of the Grand Fleet was gone, reduced to debris and memory, and the ghosts of soldiers who had died screaming against an enemy they could not harm. 3 Concord worlds were uninhabitable, their surfaces scorched clean by Hollow-feeding swarms, their populations erased as if they had never existed. But the galaxy survived. Against all odds, against every prediction, against the weight of a threat that should have consumed everything in its path, life continued. And everyone knew who to thank for that. General Elias Crane stood before the Galactic Council for the second time, but now the atmosphere in the chamber was very different. The delegates who had once laughed at stories of humanity now sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the scarred warrior and the soldiers who stood behind him like ghosts from a nightmare. There were only 50 of them, 50 human soldiers in that ancient armor. But Sierra knew that each one had died dozens of times during the battle, had been rebuilt and sent back into the fighting without rest or hesitation. They were terrifying. They were magnificent. They were humanity. Ambassador Velkith rose from her seat, her movements slow and careful, her silver scales dull with exhaustion and shame. "General Crane," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "on behalf of the Galactic Concord, I offer our deepest gratitude for your intervention against the Hollow." Crane nodded, his burning eyes revealing nothing of what he might be feeling. "We also wish to offer our apologies," Velkith continued, each word seeming to cost her tremendous effort, "for the actions of our ancestors, for the imprisonment of your people, for the 10,000 years of suffering we caused through our fear and cowardice." The chamber held its breath, waiting for Crane's response. The general was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 9 millennia. "Your ancestors locked us in the dark with the monsters," he said. "They sealed us away, hoping we would die, hoping the Hollow would solve their problem for them." Velkith flinched, but she did not look away. "They could not have known what would happen," she offered weakly. "They knew exactly what would happen," Crane replied. "The precursors were ancient and wise, and they understood that they were condemning billions of human beings to an eternity of war and death and suffering." He stepped forward, and despite herself, Velkith took a step back. "We lost Earth in the first year," Crane continued. "The Hollow consumed it, consumed our home, consumed everything we have built over 10,000 years of history." Gasps echoed through the chamber, but Crane was not finished. "We lost our colonies in the first decade, lost our children in the first century, lost our humanity itself over the millennia that followed." He raised his hand, and the delegates could see the silver lines running beneath his skin, the modifications that had transformed him into something more and less than human. "We became this," he said. "We became weapons, became monsters, became the very thing your ancestors feared, because that was the only way to survive. Silence fell over the chamber, heavy and suffocating. But we also became something else, Crane said, and his voice softened just slightly. We became survivors, became protectors, became a species that refused to let the darkness win. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of each delegate in turn. We could hate you, he said. We could despise you for what your ancestors did to us, and we would be justified in that hatred. The delegates held their breath. But hatred is a luxury we cannot afford, Crane continued. The Hollow are not defeated, merely driven back, and they will return stronger and hungrier than before. He turned back to Velketh, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. We offer you a choice, he said. Help us rebuild. Help us find a way to retrieve Earth from the sealed dimension. Help us become something more than just weapons of war. And in exchange? Velketh asked. In exchange, we will stand beside you, Crane replied. We will teach you how to fight the Hollow, how to survive against enemies that should be impossible to defeat, how to face the darkness and refuse to be consumed by it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the chamber like a promise and a warning. We remember what you did to us, he said. We will always remember, and that memory will never fade. The delegates tensed, waiting for the threat that surely must follow. But we choose to fight beside you anyway, Crane said. We choose to protect you, to save you, to give you the same chance at survival that you once tried to deny us. He straightened, and for a moment, despite his modifications and his scars and his burning eyes, he looked almost human again. That is what humanity has become, he declared. Not just warriors, not just survivors, but a people who remember everything and forgive anyway, who have every reason to seek revenge and choose mercy instead. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and then Velketh slowly bowed her head. We accept your offer, she said, and we swear, on behalf of the Galactic Concord, that we will never again make the mistake of underestimating humanity. The vote was unanimous. As the Remembrance departed to begin preparations for the next Hollow incursion, Ambassador Velketh stood alone on her balcony, watching the ancient warship climb toward the stars. We forgot why we feared them, she whispered to no one, a voice barely audible above the wind. We told ourselves they were weak, told ourselves they were primitive, told ourselves they were no threat at all. She watched the ship grow smaller and smaller against the backdrop of infinite space. But now I understand, she continued. It was never their violence that made them terrifying. It was never their weapons or their wars or their capacity for destruction. The Remembrance vanished into the darkness, leaving only the stars behind. It was their refusal to stop, Velketh said. Their absolute, unwavering refusal to ever stop. And far away, in the cold spaces between galaxies, the Hollow gathered their strength and prepared for another assault. But for the first time in their ancient existence, they hesitated. For the first time, they felt something that they had never experienced before. Fear, not of the Concord, not of the Grand Fleet, but of the strange, impossible, terrifying creatures who had fought them for 9,000 years and never once considered surrender. The humans were awake. The humans remembered. And the Hollow knew, with a certainty that chilled them to their incomprehensible cores, that the long war was far from over. In the darkness between dimensions, something that should not have been able to feel emotion whispered a single word. Humans. And that word was not a threat. It was a warning.